Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the SERMAPod. This is the podcast for the Sports and Entertainment Risk Management Alliance. I am the founder and CEO, Rich Lenkov. I'm also a very proud Canadian, as you might tell from my shirt here today. Very pleased to join some of our first Canadian members to the organization. And this is our first podcast on some Canadian sports and entertainment events. So I'm really excited to welcome Patrick Essiminy and Antoine Metayer. They are both with the law firm Stikeman, Elliott. They are based in Montreal. Stikeman Elliott is a global leader in Canadian business law. I'll tell you a little bit more about them, and then we'll welcome them. Patrick is a partner at Stikeman Elliott. As I mentioned, he's head of the Montreal office, their employment and labor practice. Patrick practices in all areas of employment and labor law. He has considerable experience in workplace health and safety matters, making him an expert who is recognized both by his peers and Canadian employers in both provincial and federal jurisdictions. He is known for his strategic and practical advice and for a practice style that is both effective and oriented to business priorities. Patrick, welcome to the SERMAPod.
Bonjour, Rich. Good morning.
Bonjour, bonjour. And Antoine Metayer is an associate at Stikeman Elliott, also in the Employment and Labor Group. Antoine practices in all areas of employment and labor law with a particular interest in legal issues involving employees in the sports and entertainment industries. Antoine, bienvenue.
Thank you, Rich. Happy to be here.
Let's learn a little bit more about Stikeman and Patrick, a little bit more about your practice. Tell us about the firm and your personal background and what your practice looks like.
For sure, Rich. Thank you. Well, Stikeman Elliott is a global leader in Canada in business law. It is always offering creative solutions to clients across Canada and around the world. Our offices, of course, in the rest of the world are really there for our Canadian clients because we only practice Canadian law. The firm provides high-quality counsel, decisive advice, workable solutions. We have offices in Montreal, Toronto, Ottawa, Calgary, Vancouver, New York, London, and Sydney. We cover a multitude of practice areas and industries. In Montreal, where Antoine and I are located, we have a specialty in corporate law, commercial litigation, tax, and of course, employment and labor law. In our labor and employment group, which I had in Montreal, we have files that touch upon all aspects of employment law, employment standards, occupational health and safety, human rights, harassment, discrimination, and disputes involving employee shareholders. So, we cover the broad gamut, which of course includes our representation of various large employers in the sports and entertainment field.
So, Patrick, when I started SERMA a little over a year ago, we just celebrated our first birthday. One of our goals, of course, was to be the resource in sports and entertainment, not just in the U.S., but frankly, everywhere in the world. And of course, being Canadian, I have a real passion for these issues as they relate to Canada, and you and I go way back, and I've known you for a while. I know you and Stikeman to have a considerable footprint in this area. So, while a lot of our current members are in fact in the U.S., we are growing in both Canada and internationally. So, why don't you give us a sense of kind of some of the hot button issues that are going on in Canada and how sports in particular are regulated in our neighbors north of the border?
Yeah. Do you want me to go, Patrick?
Of course, sure. Go ahead, Antoine.
Yeah, okay. So, of course, we have a lot of professional organization in Canada. So we have 7 teams in the NHL, which none of them won the Stanley Cup in the last 30 years. 3 teams in the...
You had to remind all the haters of that, right?
Yeah, exactly. I had to.
Won't celebrate the breaking of that streak this year, unfortunately.
We also have 3 teams in the MLS soccer team, 1 team in the MLB, and 1 team in the NBA, both in Toronto, and our very own football league, which is the CFL. We also have major events such as the Formula One, the National Bank Open in tennis, and the RBC Canadian Open in golf. And Montreal is also the headquarters of the World Anti-Doping Agency, which is in Montreal. As of how the organization and events are regulated in Canada, the vast majority of them are regulated by provincial law or regulation, so in which the organization or the event is located. In Canada, all provinces except Quebec are common law. Quebec is operated under civil law, and federal law also applies to certain circumstances, and organizations are also regulated sometimes by collective agreement for each league. So that's pretty much an overview of how in Canada sports is regulated.
All right, let's dive into the issues. Antoine, talk to us a little bit about what you've been seeing in Canada with regards to corporate reputational risk in the sports and entertainment industry.
Yeah, sure, Rich. So let's say since the rise of social media and maybe in the rise from the Me Too movement or Black Lives Matter, companies have had to act and make decisions more quickly and without necessarily having the time or being able to have all the information needed to make that decision. So this reality is not really specific to sports and entertainment, but it is, I think, more important or even more a reputation risk is more high for those organizations because they generate the feeling of belonging and the strong loyalty of the fans and the brand to the organization. And we don't need to forget that corporations that involved in sports and entertainment industry often act as corporate role models. They are involved in philanthropic initiatives and often use their employees or the athletes or the artists as corporate ambassadors. So there's often great reputational risk for organization once a story hits the public space, even more for sports and entertainment industries, because the stories when it's in the public space is spreading quickly and can be interpreted in many ways. So the organization needs to control the narrative and take control of the story. So in recent stories, for example, in Canada, we have seen more demands for pay equity between males and females. We have seen Canada's women's national soccer team make a statement that they are paid less than the men's, even if they have a better records than them. And we also seen in the U.S. the Denver Nugget mascot salary compared to the WNBA salaries of the women's. But in Canada, the most we have seen is the allegation of abuse and behaviors in sports. So more recently, we have the accusation of sexual assaults and allegation of initiation in hockey teams, junior hockey teams, and also the controversial topic of fights in hockey. So our national sports is really impacted by reputational risk for the moment.
With one hot button issue, dealing with, of course, something we've seen and covered on this podcast a lot. We've seen a lot of this in the United States, but in particular, this is an issue in Canada concerning hockey teams' initiations, allegations of bullying, allegations of abuse. What is the current state of those allegations? Why don't you bring us up to speed on that issue, Patrick?
Of course. So it started with a class action that was launched in the province of Ontario in 2020 involving 3 former players. A decision was rendered on February 3rd, 2023, so very recently. In that decision, Justice Perrell described the evidence from current players and other former players who submitted written statements as being horrific. The judge referred to these hockey players as genuine heroes. He said they failed to provide a workable litigation plan, and for that reason, he denied the request to certify their class action lawsuit. He said it was not conceivable that a singular class action would deal with the evil that has persisted for half a century in amateur hockey. After that decision, other jurisdictions took this very seriously. In Quebec, where Antoine and I practice, the premier of our province, François Legault, referring to the Quebec Major Junior Hockey League, basically said, "I cannot remain silent." He called the abuse detailed by the judge as very serious, and his provincial minister for sports said that the reports of abuse had left her speechless, adding that all sports federations must have a policy of integrity that ensures an environment that is free of abuse, harassment, and intimidation. By the way, that concept has been in our laws for decades, and this is a very, very strong topic in Quebec, generally for all employers. But in something as prominent as the Hockey League, that, as you know, is very, very passionate in Canada, it goes further. In this case, the Quebec National Assembly, which is the parliament, if you want, of the province, launched hearings into allegations of violence and hazing in the Quebec Major Junior Hockey League. This led to a lot of media attention. It also led to the resignation of the commissioner of that league, who had been in place for 37 years, a real legend in that space. Basically, after he testified before the Parliamentary Commission about junior initiation, the pressure was too high and he had to leave. In any event, he was about to retire. We are still waiting for recommendations because these hearings were only completed on March 23rd, 2023, and it will be interesting to see what the recommendations actually say.
You know, Patrick, it's really interesting. We're, again, now in the latter phases of the NHL playoffs, right? We've got the final four left, Eastern Conference, Western Conference finalists, and fighting is such a big topic, more recently than ever. You know, I'm, as you are, old school Montreal Canadiens fans. As Antoine mentioned, we last won the Stanley Cup in 1993. I can remember the moment exactly when we beat the LA Kings. Unfortunately, as Antoine mentioned, that's the last time that any Canadian team has raised the cup. Although we all know that any Stanley Cup winner has a high percentage of Canadians. But, you know, speaking of fighting, I'm sort of interested in the contrast. You know, the other night, watching my beloved Boston Celtics beat the Sixers, there was a moment in the game where one of the important players, Jaylen Brown, for the Celtics was grabbed momentarily by an opposing Sixers player on the bench. He was running by, and Georges Niang grabbed the player by the leg. And there was a technical foul, and they stopped the game, and both sides were assessed technical fouls, and it was almost a bench-clearing brawl. Similarly, in baseball the other day, there was an incident involving Bryce Harper where he was upset that an opposing Rocky looked at him the wrong way, and there was a bench-clearing brawl, although no punches were thrown. Contrast that relatively minor physical contact with what we see in hockey every day in the NHL and in the minor leagues. In the last round of the playoffs, there were some bench-clearing brawls at the end of some of the games. So, you know, hockey is or fighting is very much ingrained in the culture of hockey. Some say it always will be, but there's been some changes recently in Canada with regards to hockey, what we've seen and what the future portends for this, for fighting.
No, for sure. Before Antoine kind of gives you the update about what's been going on, you know, as you said, hockey is a contact sport. You know, that there is continuous contact, continuous checking, friction, and as you mentioned, different from baseball or basketball, these are not isolated incidents. This is, I would say, it is almost systemic in hockey that fighting is ingrained in the way that you actually manage the game, manage the message you want to send. So I think the challenge in banning fighting in hockey is a bit different than other sports. Maybe, Antoine, you want to give a little bit of an update about that?
Yeah, it is very divided. So some of them defend the fighting, some don't. But the Quebec Major League Hockey has been working toward banning fighting since 2020. The decision to ban fighting came last March after the owners voted to add a new rule to specify clearly that fighting is forbidden in the league. The ban is expected to affect ahead of the 2023-2024 season. So as divided it is, the Ontario Hockey League and the Western Hockey League, so the two other junior leagues in Canada, have stated that they are not planning to change their rules around fighting. So also many people have said their own opinions. So Nick Suzuki, the captain of the Montreal Canadiens, has taken the stand for fighting. So he says that it can protect the players that are not often protected if there's a big hit or something. As Patrick Roy, so former Hall hockey goalie of NHL and former NHL head coach and coach of the Remparts de Québec in the Quebec Major League Hockey, expressed a different opinion. So he's against fighting, even though he fought a couple of times when he was a player. So as you can see, there's a lot of different change and the NCAA, you can see that the NCAA hockey have a full face. So most of fighting in the NCAA is not there. So there's possibility for juniors not to fight, I think. But you can see different opinion. There's even Dean Bergeron, a Canadian Paralympic athlete who participated in 4 Paralympic Games, that a few days before the Quebec Major League Hockey made their decision, he went in the media to tell his story about how he became paraplegic after a hockey fight. So there's a lot of concern around fights in hockey, and the decision of the Quebec Major League just rise up this conversation.
Yeah, one of the things to that point, Antoine, one of the things we've covered extensively in SERMA, and in fact, we did one of our in-person events that was very well received was in Colorado Springs a couple of months ago at the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Training Center, and the theme there was reputational risk in sport. And what we're talking about here, really, as we've now covered for a few minutes, is reputational risk to organizations, to teams, to leagues. But another issue that's prevalent in Canada right now is not just reputational risk to these organizations, but to athletes as well. You mentioned a couple of them already, but maybe you could expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, indeed. As you said, we discussed specifically about organization and teams, but we see more and more that athletes are becoming their own brand and they're becoming influential. So in many cases, they hold the power. So many athletes such as, Michael Jordan, Tiger Woods, Lewis Hamilton, Tom Brady, they're all example of their being their own brand and having a big impact on the sports themselves. But we can also see that many less grandiose people such as I don't know, but like the show I don't know if you've seen it, but the show Drive to Survive for Formula One, Breaking Point for tennis, and Full Swing are based on promoting the athletes other than promoting the sports. So I think this is being the fans are able to see the lifestyle and the brand of the athletes, and I think that's what the fans are interested now. But it's also comes with a lot of reputational risk for the athlete himself. The organization can change management and everything, but it's harder to change the reputational risk of the athletes himself. So some athletes will need to think about this reputational risk to them and maybe think before speaking. But as I mentioned before, you can see in the conversation that it's Nick Suzuki that took the stand and it's not the Montreal Canadiens. But the fact that he's the captain of the Montreal Canadiens, maybe the Montreal Canadiens is also implicated in what he is saying. But it's really Nick Suzuki himself who took the stand. So there's many reputational risks a lot of reputational risk that athletes need to consider now more than ever.
Picking up on that point, Patrick, again, we like to, on our podcasts and in our content and generally in our organization, SERMA, we like to really cover issues that are breaking, and we pride ourselves on being at the forefront of these issues because every single day, we're seeing issues involving claims and risk in sports and entertainment. So just in the last, few hours, right, we've seen Ja Morant, who's a, very prominent guard for the Memphis Grizzlies. A couple of days ago, there was a social media release where he was seen again brandishing a handgun. This is after he was already suspended, I think, 8 games by the NBA a few months ago for the same for a similar incident. There's talks that he'll be suspended at least 25 games into the next season. We also learned this morning that there was a WNBA Las Vegas Aces case where the head coach, a very prominent head coach, perhaps the most prominent head coach in women's sports, Becky Hammon, who's been rumored to actually take over an NBA job one day, she was accused of some improprieties in the workplace. There's some news on that this morning. In the NFL, a couple of attorney generals are investigating workplace culture in the NFL. So, these are large, multi-billion-dollar organizations who every day are dealing with risks to their reputation. The NBA, of course, doesn't want to be associated with gunplay and violence, and that's what they're dealing with today. So you're in this space, of course. How do you talk to your clients? How do you advise them on dealing with these risks, these assaults on their reputation? And is that different when it comes to corporations and organizations?
I don't think that the general approach is going to be different if you're representing a sports organization or entertainment. What is different is that the risk is often going to be higher and faster. Since every step and every move of an organization that is in the public domain and that is followed by the media is going to just become something of its own, and it's going to be harder to manage because of the pace of information right now with the different social media platforms, with the internet, and with the posts and the reposts. Ultimately, when you're representing a sports team or entertainment a company, what you have to realize is that the brand is way bigger than just the team. And the impact can be very, very heavy to assume if you make the wrong call. So I would say, there has to be four approaches. The best approach, which is true for most of our clients, is to be proactive. To try to assess the risk of doing something before you do it. A good example is a draft pick. Who are you going to pick? Do you know enough about that individual? Do you, even though that person may be a great athlete, are there any other issues that you need to think about and that may come back and cause a risk down the road? So anyone that you're hiring, I think today, a good background check, a good social media check, a good understanding of who you're associating yourself with is important. And the examples that you gave about that basketball player that's showing a firearm may be something that could have been managed differently had we known that individual had issues. So basically, the best risk assessment is the one that is planned. Being ahead of the curve is always better. When it is not possible to anticipate and to manage risk in advance, it is essential to, of course, deal with it as fast as possible and to get as much information as possible. And that means that there are situations where you have to investigate very fast, you have to gather the facts very fast, and you have to make sure that you're making decisions along the way, understanding the different facts. The second tip I would say is you've got to be consistent. You cannot be improvising a strategy every minute, every hour, every day. You have to decide what you want to do with experts. You have to be careful. You cannot commit to things that you don't know. You don't want to put yourself in a position where you're going to go back on your word. And you've got to basically have a communication strategy which is consistent, very tight, and that is going to be the same all the way through. That's very, very important. I think the third point is to be transparent. Today, what you realize is that the culture of silence, the culture of keeping things inside is getting more and more difficult. It takes one chat, one post, one picture, one tweet for everything to come out. So maybe it is better to be transparent from the get-go, understanding that it is very, very hard to keep things contained for a long time. And therefore, a transparent and consistent and coherent approach is important. I think the fourth tip that I can give is know your limits. What does that mean? When you have an issue come up, surround yourself with the right people, with the right experts. I've seen some of my clients in those fields try to assign tasks to internal leaders, but it's not their fault. Law is not their specialty. Risk management is not their specialty. Communication is not their specialty. So when you are confronted with an issue, you have to surround yourself immediately with the right people, with the right skill set. It is good to have one leader who kind of coordinates everything, but it is very, very important to have the right people around you. When a client calls me for a harassment situation, my first recommendation is let's get the best investigator on this right away. Don't try to deal with it yourself, because if you don't do a good job, it's going to backfire immediately on you. So, these are the four tips that I would give. I mean, I can give you a lot, but, these are the four areas which I think are very, very important.
So, guys, recently we saw in Canada a couple of months ago the issue regarding inequity in how women athletes are paid, and in particular, members of the Women's Canada national soccer team versus their male counterparts. There was a dispute, there was a strike. It was resolved fairly quickly, although I'm not sure it was resolved to everyone's satisfaction. But similar to Canada, we've seen in the U.S. and we're seeing across the board in many areas this growing, and very fortunate trend, of course, to level the playing fields when it comes to paying athletes. Right, the argument that's been around for a while counter to that is that the disparity is based on the income generated by those sports, right? So when we saw this in the U.S., the argument was that the U.S. men's soccer team generated more income in terms of sponsorships, in terms of popularity, as it relates to viewership, in terms of sales. and that's why their salaries were higher than the women. Well, that was quickly debunked, and thankfully the women's soccer team in the U.S., who is actually probably more popular than the men's, that was equalized more. I just saw a really interesting interview with Natalie Portman, a very well-known actress who is an investor in a NWSL team. And she said that while we acknowledge that, there is some difference in the popularity of men's versus women's soccer, she wants to hold, some media outlets and others accountable for that. And her point is, if only the word got out about what a quality product and what, tremendous athletes are playing the sport, then we would have more opportunity to sell our product like the men. So I think there's a lot to that. And again, that's the trend here in the U.S. I assume that's the way things are trending in Canada too, to try to level the playing fields between sports, not just between genders, but between sports that are maybe not as well known and other sports.
Yeah, so I would say, obviously what is particular about the women's soccer team in Canada is that it is a very good team. I believe they won the gold medal in the Tokyo Olympics. And there's a lot of potential for that team, I think, in an upcoming World Cup as well. So, Canada, Quebec, provinces in Canada all have the same concept of pay equity. In other words, if we look at the legislation across the provinces, there is the concept of pay equity, namely that jobs that are predominantly held by women should be paid the same way as men equivalent jobs. I think that in the case of women's soccer, there is the disparity in terms of pay, which can be attributable to sometimes gender, but also just to the popularity of sports. So I think, as you mentioned, if people want to support the idea of reducing disparity, support the sport, attend the games, corporations have to start investing in these sports. And I think that's going to help generally alleviate any disparity. But I think that the second part here that was important is that even in terms of the structural support for that sport of women's soccer, there was a complaint that they were not getting the same training, the same facility, the same equipment. So I think it was a bit deeper than just the actual pay equity issue. I think it was just a more generalized issue about the general support of Soccer Canada. And I think that was addressed, and I think that it created a bit more advantages.
Our last
Antoine, if you want to add anything to what I just said, or if you...
No, I think you said it all, and it's not. Yeah, I think the point you did that is great is that the fact that the women's soccer team has a better record than the male soccer team. So this is why it's kind of weird that the men have more budget but are less productive. So.
All right, Antoine, Patrick, last question here on the SERMAPod. We talked about the NHL playoffs earlier. Unfortunately, there are no Canadian teams left standing. Who do you like? We got Carolina versus Florida in the East. We got Vegas and Dallas left in the West. What are your predictions for who's going to raise the cup this year?
Well, Vegas has a lot of Canadian players, so I think I'll go with Vegas.
The right answer. Go with Canada when in doubt.
Well, I find Florida is the story of these playoffs. They've done a lot of things which were very surprising, including beating the Bruins, which I thought were a leading team for this year, and then beating the Maple Leafs. And apologies to all my Montreal friends, but once Toronto won, I was happy to support them. I think they had a great team, and I regret they couldn't go further. So I think Florida has a good chance. They have good momentum, and playoffs is all about momentum. You have to mesh at the right time as a team to win a championship, and I think that's where they are right now.
Habs in 2024, even though we didn't win the Connor Bedard sweepstakes, we'll be looking for a great draft pick and high hopes for the Canadiens in 2024. I want to thank very much Patrick Essiminy, Antoine Metayer from Stikeman, Elliott. Thank you so much for joining us on the SERMAPod.
Thank you, Rich.
Thank you, Rich. Look forward to seeing you soon.